You're listening to The Pain Chaser 1, Ambuscade. This audiobook contains violence, torture, drug use, and scenes of a graphic and often disturbing sexual nature. It should go without saying that it is not intended for children. Now turn up the sound, turn down the lights, and find a comfortable place to hide. Because fear has a face, and I'm going to show it to you. Chapter 10. Rob had become separated from the others, eventually closing himself within a random classroom on the second floor. He paced the room in circles, his terror taking him over completely and driving out any coherent thought. He paced because pacing was all he could think to do. He had just seen a man die. Not just die, but have his head cleaved open by something that looked like it belonged in the front of a heavy metal album. The man's name had been Phil. He'd shot the thing, and it didn't do shit. That monster had just picked him up and clawed off his face, slicing off the front of his skull like it was paper mache. He could see into the man's exposed brain. Rob suddenly gagged at the memory, but thankfully, nothing came up. His hands and face were numb. He shook them to try to return the feeling, ran his fingers through his hair. That thing, that monster, could be coming for him next. It looked like a man, but it couldn't be. No man moved like that. It was graceful in a frightening way. The creature's shape was deformed, almost grotesque, but the way it had moved, and had been so precise. Like its body had been crafted to move that way. Like it had been designed to hurt and kill. Rob put his hands over his eyes and pressed, trying to get a grip on himself. He was crying silently. He didn't want to die in this place. He could try to get outside, but the snow out there was 1.5 feet deep, and he was miles from anyone who could help. If that thing followed him out into the snow, no. It would make more sense to stay hidden. He just needed to get straight. The sadness was in him, worse than ever. It had horrible timing. This was like being in a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. Maybe the coke could help. He still had a decent amount left. If he could just get straight, he might be able to cope better. And coping meant surviving. It had definitely helped that morning when he and Annie had gone down into the basement. If he hadn't had it then, he doubted he would have had the guts to explore that strange little room. He fumbled the little baggie out of his pocket with nerveless hands, and untied it. He bent and shook a measure of fine white powder onto the webbing between his forefinger and thumb, as was his habit. He sniffed it back quickly, throwing his head back and pinching his burning nostrils. As his watering eyes regained focus, he saw that there was a figure standing in the doorway watching him. It was Tabby. He froze like a deer in headlights. She had been crying too. Tears streaked her face, leaving dark runs in her makeup, and her eyes were red and puffy. She looked at him with the curious look of a lost child. The coke was working him over, and before he could even begin to think of what to say, she was walking over to him. "Hi," she said, smiling weakly. "Hi," he said back, a feeling of unreality stealing over him. "Can I have some?" she asked, pointing at the baggie of coke still clutched in his hand. He nodded dumbly and handed her the little baggie. He watched as she poured some onto her outstretched fingers and snorted it. A wide grin broke over her face, and she rolled her eyes back, exaggeratedly. "God, it's been a long time since I've had any of that. Thank you." "No problem," he said, taking the baggie back from her. She smiled at him. "Did I startle you just now?" "A little," he admitted, returning her smile, but for once, he was happy to have her there. Maybe it was mostly the coke going to work, but he already felt a little better. "Rob," she asked, "what is going on in this place?" He shrugged. "I have no idea." "That thing," she said, but couldn't finish. I know, he said simply. What it did to that cop, that shouldn't even be possible. The statement made the images of Phil come back in a rush. His head opening up like a piece of fruit, shuddering on the floor like a broken toy. I'm really beginning to rethink what it is that I believe is possible, Rob said. Are you okay? She asked him, but he sensed that she was really asking it of herself. There were tears in the corners of her eyes again. Yeah, he lied and smiled down at her. Are you? She shook her head, and then she had her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. This was a different side to Tabby than he'd ever seen. Her usual edge had been dulled. It was funny how easily fear could tear down somebody's defenses. Though the drugs probably had something to do with it too. He hugged her to him, grateful for the comfort he himself took from the embrace. Do you think we're going to get out of this alive? She asked him. Absolutely, he said, stroking her hair. We just need to stick together from now on. I don't want to die, she sobbed. I know. I thought when Steve was killed that maybe it was an accident. That he fell out of the window or something. I thought maybe you just imagined the thing in the window. But that thing, that huge fucking thing, it killed him. Just like it did to that cop. Tore him apart. Rob's thoughts suddenly flitted back to the two pictures Anton had shown him on the internet. One man torn completely in two, with his viscera lying in a puddle before him. The other with his jaw ripped free, and his tongue hanging out. I know, Rob said again. It seemed to be all he could manage. Will you protect me, Rob? She asked him, her voice muffled against his chest. He could feel the wetness of her tears permeating his shirt. Of course, he said. We're going to get out of here alive. She looped her hands around his neck and was staring into his eyes. Then she was kissing him. It caught Rob by such surprise that he almost stumbled backward. But he found that kissing her was exactly what he wanted to be doing at that moment in time. It was strange, but the coke and the need for comfort coupled to make him very horny. As her tongue explored his mouth, he felt himself growing hard against her. She seemed to have noticed too, as her hand was now trailing down the length of his cock through his jeans. He kissed her neck deeply, opening the buttons of her blouse so that he could free her breast. Her skin was tan and dusted with freckles that trailed from the rim of her collarbone down to the swell of her perfectly round, fake tits. He kneaded his hand between her breasts, squeezing the left globe tightly, and took her nipple into his mouth, flicking it lightly with his tongue and forcing a low moan to escape her. Do you like them? She asked, crooking her head down at him at a strange angle. Yeah, he said, and actually laughed. She obviously had issues with her body, otherwise she never would have had the boob job, but in his time and place, the statement just sounded so queer. Here he was, hiding out from some bloodthirsty, 7-foot-tall monster, and he was groping a woman he normally couldn't stand. What? She asked. Nothing, he said. I guess I just realized how weird this all is. I mean, I never would have thought of you and I together. We're not even friends. Do you want to stop? She asked. Not at all, he said. Rob? Do you want to fuck me? She asked him, pressing her lips close to his ear and running her hand down his pants and along the length of his bare shaft. He did, and he told her so. Annie was tired of running. She'd either been running or hiding since early that morning. Now, she was alone, scared, and her stomach hurt. But if she stopped, that awful thing would catch her. It had been chasing her since it killed the cop on the second floor. One glance over her shoulder told her that it was still pursuing her. Worse, it was now carrying the fire axe taken from the scene of the dead man's body. Strange thing was, she'd seen the way it had moved when it had killed the man. There was no doubt in her mind that it could outrun her if it wanted to, but she had the funny feeling that it did not actually want to catch her, that it just wanted to chase her. It wasn't trying to kill her yet, just torment her. It moved with a strange plodding motion that was almost playful, like a child chasing a dog around the dining room table. In her mind, it seemed to regard her as a toy. Once she had tripped and fallen,